So moving on to our last speaker for the direct impact and EV investment session, we have Maria English, the CEO of Impact Lab. Impact Lab is an analytics startup that connects decision makers with information on impact. And the last time we chatted, Maria told me about how they are developing a platform for measuring impact for the not-for-profit sector, but also, I believe, projects. So this may become a very useful tool for those of us that are interested in engaging in impact investing. So thank you for your time, Maria, and over to you.
Thanks very much. Talofa lava, it's a pleasure to be here. Greetings to those there in the room and also online. So as Sebastian said, at Impact Lab, what we do is work with investors and those delivering projects and social interventions to measure the impact of those investments for the people that they're intended to help. So very much focused in the social impact measurement space. And we have been around now for just over 2 years. We've measured the impact of about $120 million of investment across about 130 different programs and social interventions. So depending how you look at it, we've learned a lot, but also we're really just at the tip of the iceberg, I think, of understanding how do you estimate the impact of investment in social change in a way that really helps us to do more of it, because that's really the point, I guess, of the investment. So what I thought I'd do today is just share a little about our overall approach and the journey that we've been on over the past few years, really just learning primarily from our customers who've tended to be philanthropic and impact first investors, as well as non-profits of all sizes, and just sharing some of what we've learned about how to do this in a way that supports investment decision making to change lives. So I'll just share my screen. Is that clear for everyone?
Yep, great, thank you.
Cool. So our vision is to help create a world where investment works for communities so people can live the lives that they choose. So I guess we have a pretty simple definition of impact in the social investment context, which is people are able to form aspirations for their own lives and those of their families and communities, and then they're able to pursue those aspirations. And these are just 3 people whose stories we've got to know through our work with different nonprofits around New Zealand. So just to share a little bit about them, on the left we have Bella. Now Bella was born with Down syndrome and she also had a stroke at birth. And she worked with an intensive early intervention service called the Champion Centre over the first 5 years of her life. And this is a photo of her getting her yellow belt in karate. She's also just completing a barrister training and internship and aiming to move into a job probably in the legal field. So that's Bella. The second person we have here is Eliza. And Eliza was picked up by police, pregnant, living in her car. And she was referred to an organisation we've been working with called Te Tuinga Whānau, who are based in Tauranga. And this is Eliza in her emergency housing. So Te Tuinga Whānau partnered with the local RSA to provide intensive emergency housing, but with a lot of relational wraparound care to support people into a next step. And Eliza commented to the newspaper, this was the first time in a long time she'd actually been able to sit on a bed and be able to see a bathroom that she had access to as a pregnant woman. And she is aiming to get her kids in school, reconnect with her whānau, and get a job. And the third person we have there is Rob. So Rob was in and out of prison for many years, did 78 programs in prison to try and turn his life around, and none of them worked for him. And he connected with a charity called Te Whakaora Tangata, who are based in Clendon in South Auckland. And through walking alongside that team, he's massively turned his life around. He now has his own lawnmower business. He's not had a single offence, not even a traffic offence. And he recently reconnected with his mother, who he hadn't seen since he was an infant. So this is what impact is. It's people being able to form and pursue the aspirations that they have for their own lives, those of their children and those of their community. So the opportunity as investors is to invest in this good, but also to do it better. because the process we're learning in Impact Lab, the process by which change occurs in people's lives is complicated, it's long-term, and often it takes a lot of taking one step forward and another step back. And so what we seek to do is to connect decision makers with information that they can trust and use to do good better. And really what making investment working looks like is connecting the decisions at all levels to a view of what does positive change look like for the people and families that this investment is aiming to help. And so we work primarily with the impact organisations who are delivering services and programs to families, primarily in our case, nonprofits. And then with the investment organisations that are investing in those organisations and their projects and interventions. And then, of course, you've got the capital sources who are kind of the hidden decision maker who are entrusting their capital oftentimes to investors in the belief it is going to do some good. And so what we seek to do is to help provide a data flow between these decision makers and measurement of impact so that we get a feedback loop going, so that those who are delivering interventions can start to collect structured data to understand what is the impact that our investment in resources, energy, strategic focus is having for the families we care about, and how can we adapt and adjust those offerings, particularly as the external macro environment changes, most recently, obviously, radically for some organisations with COVID. How do we adapt and improve and constantly do better at serving the families and people we exist for? And then at the investment level, it's understanding, well, what is the kind of positive change we want to create for whom, where? And then what data can we get back to see whether that's happening? And how can we adjust our investment strategy of money, obviously, but also time and support to the ecosystem of organisations that investors are working with to create that kind of positive change. So how Impact Lab came about, and I guess how we got to deciding that this is the way we wanted to support was through the experience of our founders in government originally. So we were founded by Sir Bill English, Emily Mason, and a philanthropist who spent a lot of time investing for social change. And some of the work that was done in New Zealand government a few years ago was to form a integrated data environment where we could link up people's experiences of government services at an individualized level. So you can see how people are journeying through, for example, the education system, then through MSD and through the justice system. And so one of the really powerful exercises that was done with this linked data, which is still relatively unique globally to New Zealand, is that the nerds at Stats NZ stacked up every person in New Zealand based on the lifetime cost of government services for each individual person. And what they found was this curve, which is basically showing that 15% of New Zealanders with the highest needs use half of government services on a costed basis. And so there's a couple of conclusions we can draw from that about how we can think about investing for impact. The first is that we must pay attention to the core relationship between cost or investment and change, because for many of the people in that 15%, they require significantly more, often many times magnitude more investment than those who have lower support needs. But when you do invest to support someone like Rob, who's been in and out of prison through his entire life, the value of that, both for his own personal experience and to the system and the cost savings of that, is again many magnitudes higher than it is further down the curve. So that at Impact Lab led us to focus on SROI analysis, social return on investment, because it gives us models and structures for linking cost and investment to value and impact. The second thing is that when we look at that 15% of the population who have the highest support needs, they're very different from each other. So the averages don't really work anymore, and we have to disaggregate to understand as closely as we can the unique context and needs of different people and what's going on in their lives. And so that creates, as you can imagine, some real challenges for a traditional standardized impact measurement model, which we can talk about more in the Q&A if it's of interest. The third thing is the importance of trust and relationship. Because we've now worked with probably at least 50 different frontline providers working with that 15% with the highest support needs. And what we hear again and again is the way that they support those people is extremely flexible and actually often looks quite different. But the thing that's common is the nexus of trust and relationship that's formed. And so when we measure, we need to start to unpack through particularly operational data from those organizations, what kind of relationship is created, and actually understand the investment profile of building trusting relationships. And then the final thing is that we need to take a lifetime view of impact, because through this government integrated data, we can see that people through journey through services, and often there's a time lag that's really significant between when you'd want to make investment and when you can realize the benefits of that. So to give a simple example, for Bella at the Champion Centre is working with kids aged 0 to 5, but the work that they do could prevent those children ending up with chronic health conditions and extreme use of hospitals in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. So we need to think about change and social change from a lifetime perspective. So what we did was we looked at those findings and turned it into a basic model of measuring and understanding social value, with the idea that we should give these models to the people who are most able to act on the findings to change how investment happens and change what happens in communities. And that's the funders out there in the community and also those providing services who have the relationship with the people whose lives we want to change. So this was our kind of really simple model for thinking about social value, which is that people have a life trajectory. There's a path their lives have taken, and this could be a person or it could also be a family. We do a lot of work at the kind of family or household level as well. And there's events and things that have happened in their lives. And at the point they interact with a program or intervention or project you might want to invest in, the opportunity is to positively shift the future pathway that their life can take. And that's both around avoiding negative outcomes. So in Rob's case, potentially future offending and ending up back in prison, but also achieving positive outcomes that might have otherwise been out of reach, like being self-employed, having a good income, being able to lift your own family and children out of poverty. And so when we measure social value, what we're looking to measure is the difference between the pathway without support and the pathway that's possible with support. And that's the difference as an investor that you can make. And so we then kind of identify, using pretty typical cost-benefit analysis approaches, the drivers of social value. And basically the questions we need to answer there is, well, what changes, to what extent, for whom, and at what scale? So when we work with organisations, we use a combination of public data and impact valuation from the IDI and other data sources, as well as the frontline organisations' own operational data about who they're reaching, how many of the people they reach successfully complete the process of the intervention, and what is the opportunity to make a difference for those people. And we wind that up to calculate social value and compare that to the cost profile to calculate social return on investment. So that's kind of, I suppose, the origins of our approach and the basic model. So then how do we actually roll that out in a way that helps decision makers? And how do we kind of, I suppose, function as a useful intermediary in this emerging market? And so what we did next was we built a calculator. And the idea was pretty simple, and you might have seen some other, like the Social Values Bank or similar models like this, where you plug in some inputs, some calculations get made, and you get an SROI number. It seems pretty elegant, but we found pretty quickly a few big problems with that approach. The first one was that many of the impact organisations we're working with have never been invested in or rewarded for collecting good data about who's engaging with them, what their lives look like, or what positive changes occur. So often organisations need significant support to actually even realise the value of the data they already have. And the most extreme recent case of that was an organisation down south where a social worker had to spend 3 days literally trawling through filing cabinets to get what turned out to be extremely rich data about the experience of their families across a range of vulnerability factors, like what families are experiencing family harm, drug abuse, have been referred from other social services, really rich impact information, no good way to access it. So that's the first thing, is we realise we need to actually support organisations to use their data so they can improve it. The second thing is that the trade-offs of standardisation are not visible in this type of automated measurement approach. So obviously, to aggregate, particularly at a portfolio level, And to be able to compare and benchmark, we need to standardize, but there's a lot of trade-offs to be made in that process, and we need to get a fuller picture of what it is we're measuring in the frontline reality to understand which trade-offs can and can't be made. The third thing is it was really hard to get confidence around what outcomes we're measuring, because it is a bit of subjective choice as to what is the good we're trying to create there. And we realized we actually need to work with the organizations doing the work to understand, well, what matters to them and what do they think they're trying to achieve as a starting point to then measure what we think they're actually achieving. The fourth thing was that there's a whole lot, you can probably imagine anyone with frontline experience in social change, there's just so much variation, and we need to have a process of learning with our customers to unpack what forms of variation are important. So just to give a really simple example, if you're investing in a project that involves navigating people to services that already exist versus building those services yourself, the investment profile looks totally different. And that's a kind of a dimension of variation that as an investor matters quite a lot, because the counterfactual is always, well, we could just connect people to a thing that already exists rather than building something new. So we realized we need to learn alongside our customers to unpack what variation matters. And finally, if people don't trust the metrics, they're not going to use them, no matter how robust your methodology is. So out of that, we developed what we call the Good Measure Journey, which is now typically a 4 to 6 month process. We'd love to recollapse that once we've done the learning, but really it involves sitting down with the frontline organisation, understanding what they do and why and the change they see, collecting key operational data from them, including where they've got feedback and data from participants. We always use that where we can. And then we do the back-end analysis, connect to a database of hundreds of studies to kind of inform our assumptions around how effective we think the model is. And then we conduct the analysis. And then the work really starts, because that's when we share it with the investors and the frontline providers and work through together, what the heck does this mean and how can we use this to do good better. So this is an example of the output, which is one of our Good Measure reports. So this one is a disability employment organisation. And we found that for every $1 that's invested, we can estimate $4.80 of return to New Zealand, particularly in terms of reduced healthcare costs, better income, and reduced benefits from MSD for people who have been on the unemployment benefit for a long time, have a disability, but then are supported successfully into work. And so some of the dimensions that play here, if we think about that curve, that J curve, are that we found that looking in the IDI, people with a disability excuse me, I've set myself a timer. People with a disability it's basically 4 times less likely that if they start off unemployed within a 12-month period, they'll move into work than if they were not disabled. But once they do achieve employment, it's often at a higher income level than a non-disabled person, because many of these people have amazing skills and qualifications, but the barriers to them accessing employment are actually societal ones. So this is the kind of analysis that we can unpack at a project level. And the other thing that we're now doing is aggregating at a portfolio level for funders. So what you can see here is a kind of hypothetical example of real analysis that we produce for investors. And the y-axis shows you the social value estimated per person in the program, and the x-axis shows the cost per person of that program. And so what you can sort of infer here is that you could have organizations that have exactly the same SROI, and we've actually literally seen this. One organization costs $50,000 a person, and one organization, it costs $50 a person to do the intervention. But they're dealing with people with very different vulnerability factors and opportunity pathways. And so actually you end up at the same return. And that's really all to say there's no right or wrong when it comes to investing and selecting where you want to focus. It's more about unpacking the drivers of the underlying metrics to understand what it is you're investing in, doing it pretty consciously. And so what we can see here, for example, is that we've got a model that's really much higher cost than some of the other programs, not significantly higher value. And it's also at a decent scale, which is shown by the size of the bubble. So that might be one we'd want to unpack, why it's producing so much less value at so much more cost than some of the other programs in the portfolio. So there's a kind of a whole world of things to unpack here, and we're really just at the start of the process of working alongside investors to do that. So that's really all that I wanted to share, and I guess we'll hand over for questions.
Thank you, Maria. Any questions from the floor? No. Okay. I had one question because often when I've discussed impact investing with potential or acting impact investors is that they are still seeking a financial return. Do you think this sort of measurement might be useful for those types of impact investors that aren't on a purely philanthropic basis? And maybe that sort of social return on investment could be added to your financial return to have sort of one metric across your impact investments. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I think that's the opportunity of translating social value into a dollar figure. In our case, primarily avoided future fiscal liability. So it enables you to do that kind of layering because you've got the same reference point, which is the dollar that you've invested. So I think it's certainly possible, and we're just starting to do quite a bit of work in the housing space and the social housing space, and I think that's one area in particular where it will be really interesting to see how those different views can be combined.
Yeah, great. I actually had someone at the training day yesterday ask about how can we take these different impacts and put them into a return figure so we can show our board, yes, our financial return was slightly lower, but if you take our total return that includes this sort of social return, then we may be able to convince them to take on these projects. So maybe some guys would be worth doing. Oh, a question from Renata, is that right? No, just unmuted, cool. So with no more questions, we're back on time, which is great. We're going to take a lunch break, so I'm going to take the guys here in Dunedin for some food. There will be a couple of poll questions popping up if you're interested in participating that sort of lead into the next session. So up next after lunch at 1:30, we have responsible investing and biodiversity. And after that, we'll be talking about CFI, responsible investing. And lastly, before the afternoon tea, we will present some CEF Group research that was actually partnered with Mindful Money. So thanks again, Maria, and all of our speakers from that session. I hope you stay to join us and listen to the rest of the day. And yeah, see you all soon. Thanks.